Okay, welcome everyone to 52 Living Ideas and Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society members. Welcome to you. Tonight we're going to discuss the legacy and thinking of Lewis Mumford, who is, I would say, one of the great original innovative thinkers of the 20th century. He's a true polymath, a true, in a lot of ways, a true comprehensivist thinker, as he touched on so many different areas of human endeavors, including technology, sociology, history, art. Wikipedia says even literary criticism. I don't know much about that aspect of his career, but I'm sure he did that as well, because he lived a very long life, a very long and fruitful life. He was born in 1895 and died, I believe, in 1990. So that's not too far back. So amazingly, I was thinking about what it must have been for somebody who was born in 1895 to witness a radical transformation of life from primarily, I mean, he was born in New York, but still New York was transformed in that period from a what it was back then to a major metropolis and a major financial and financial hub and every other hub of whatever sense you want to think of it. So Mumford witnessed firsthand the transformation of society and our civilization, which happened I would say the last 100 years was we all those who lived in that time frame witnessed an amazing transformation, and amazing not in a sense of necessarily positive, but amazing in the sense that it was so momentous and so sweeping in its in a lot of its aspects. So I don't really have a good systematic classification of Mumford's ideas. What I'm going to do is basically try to provide not a comprehensive overview, but more of a teaser of some of his salient ideas that influenced me and that I found particularly interesting. And then I'd love to hear from you, those of you who have read him and have incorporated some of his thoughts into your own sort of philosophy of life. I'd love to hear what you think about his work and his legacy. What I'm going to do first, though, is introduce a couple of books. I think Jeannie already shared the book that she has, which is Technics and Civilization, right, Jeannie? Do you mind showing that? Because that actually, I think that's his first important book. I think it was published in around 1930s, 1934 or something like that. And that's one of the first books I read. And it really hooked me on Mumford. Actually, Jeannie, I take it back. I think I read Technics and Civilization first, and then I read The City in History, which is another great book of his. And let me see if I can focus. It's very hard to focus with the...
Not focus.
Here we go. So this is a big, thick volume, which basically traces history of... Yeah, same for the other one. Yeah. He writes very prolifically, and but he's a good writer and interesting to read. So The City in History traces development of cities in history, which is kind of like what the title says. You get exactly what he's selling, and it's a very interesting perspective, though, that he has. It's not necessarily just a pure history of cities, but he has a very interesting philosophical take on it, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And then finally, another book that I have on my shelf is The Myth of the Machine, the Pentagon of Power. So that's another big volume and probably summarizes his thinking. This was written a little bit later. So the Technics and Civilization was his first important work that introduced some of his core ideas that stay with him. That was written in the 1930s. The City in History was written around 1960. And then the Myth of the Machine, which is a series of 2 volumes, was written around 1970. So he pretty much we can trace the development of his thinking before I dive into the ideas, I do want to mention something that we talked about just before the meeting was started, which is amazingly, I kind of expected Mumford to be a professor of sociology or something like that before I read his, description of his biography on Wikipedia. Amazingly, the man never even finished an undergraduate degree, but he had an amazingly interesting life. He um, was in the Navy. He worked as a radio technician. He worked in several magazines, publishing and then writing, and basically did a lot of his own research. As soon as he started publishing his own ideas, he received all sorts of awards and might have gotten a couple of honorary degrees and so on. But amazingly, the man never completed a formal higher education, undergraduate education, which is amazing to me. And I love that. I think it's great to see somebody like that who is a little bit outside of the academia, and perhaps because of that, he has a unique standpoint and a perspective that it enriches us all. So with that preface, I'm going to dive right in and talk a little bit about Technics and Civilization, which is the first work that really put him on the map. And Technics and Civilization is centered really around the development and the role of technology in the development of humanity. This was a really interesting work for me because it underscored the importance of biases and perspectives that influence how we do research. So basically, anthropologists, they have to work with what they get. And what they get is remains of bones, remains of tools, in other words, material artifacts. And so a lot of history is framed in terms of the materials that are left behind. Now, that's one side of it. The other side of it is that people that do study anthropology live in the age that we're all in today, an age that is undergirded and completely dominated by technology. So we frame everything in those terms. It's very hard to get out of that frame of thinking. And so we naturally try to explain history in terms of technology and tools. There's a very famous saying by Thomas Carlyle that man is a tool-making beast, a beast that makes tools. And that's our definition, according to Carlyle. That's Marx would probably agree, because I believe he said something like labor made an ape into a human being or something along those lines. I'm not sure I'm quoting correctly, but that's the import of that statement. So Marx and Carlyle were kind of on the same page there. And so is a lot of modern history and anthropology. They look at everything in terms of material culture and in terms of tools that we discover as we trace human history. Think of the very delineation of human history. We have the Paleolithic age, the Mesolithic age, and the Neolithic age. What does it all have in common? Well, lithic is lithos is Greek for stone. So the Old Stone Age, the Middle Stone Age, and the New Stone Age. Then we have the Bronze Age, and then the Iron Age, and so on. And so everything seems to be the skeleton in our frame of thinking is immediately set in a particular direction. And we think only in terms of the tools and kind of the perfection of those tools, the development of tool making, and so on. And one of the contributions of Mumford, in my mind, is challenging that entire approach and that entire mindset by saying that, just because material objects are the only objects that are left behind, just because it's easy to study and classify them, doesn't mean that the study of human history and human society is necessarily governed by these things that are left behind. You have to look at what's not there just as much as what is there. And so he turns it on its head, and from the outset, he challenges this notion that human beings are, and human civilization is to be governed or to be evaluated on the basis of technology and how perfect or imperfect um, how perfectly or imperfectly it uses particular tools. And so in the very beginning, he quotes another writer who says, ritual, art, poetry, music, dance, philosophy, science, myth, religion, all of these are just as necessary for man as bread. And he calls all of these things that are listed here a symbolic activity. And that was his big moniker of kind of summarizing all of these activities that are non-material as symbolic. Of course, language falls squarely in that same classification as symbolic activity. And so Mumford challenges the status quo at that time, the status quo in anthropology and sociology, and says, look, you cannot just look at tools and just at the development of the material culture. You have to understand that the most important what's happening is happening in human psyche. And that is the real progress that's being made, or regress that's being made, is in the human social development of the individual and the society as a whole. And the tools are just there to, in some ways, reflect or express what's happening. They're not necessarily the guiding principle. With that, of course, he goes back to the Greek notion of techne. And techne is a Greek word that we typically translate as either craft or skill. Of course, that's the root word for technology, but today it's used in a much narrower sense than the way Greeks used it. For them, this word incorporated both the skill, the craft, but also the art of making something. And so there was no separate word for art. It was techne. Techne was both art. It was to a degree science that was required to produce something, and it was the skill and the craftsmanship to create a particular artifact. So in that sense, techne is what advances human civilization, not necessarily technology in its narrower sense. And Mumford uses another term. He calls it monotechnics and polytechnics. So monotechnics is the technology that is developed for its own sake, if you will. Polytechnics is technology that is supposed to organically fit in with the rest of human endeavors and human expression, and in fact, not just expression, but the very nature of humanity. So human beings have a certain nature, and technology can either detract or enhance that. And a lot of Mumford's critique of modern, I guess, endeavors and approaches to technology are based on this notion that they're actually detracting from human nature. They're not enabling us to flourish in the fullest sense, in the sense of what Aristotle perhaps or Plato would call flourishing. And so our cities are built around convenience and efficiency, but that efficiency is not efficiency that improves our own lives. It improves kind of some sort of abstract goal, but not actually individual well-being. So that's Technics and Civilization. And again, I'm really summarizing here because I don't want to get into any detail on any of these, because otherwise I'll be talking for another 2 hours. So I want to switch to city and history, which is another great exploration of kind of the same ideas, but now traced from this different lens of what makes a city a city. And Mumford really synthesizes a lot of his philosophical ideas into this work, which traces what he thinks is the original impetus and motive for why cities actually developed. And this was another one of those great moments for me when I read the first chapter in that book. And he talks about the ritual being the original motive for actually settling anywhere. So if you remember your history, the oldest hominids were foragers. They were not, settling anywhere. They foraged. They moved from place to place, just like animals do. And there's no real reason why human beings should be different from, I don't know, a herd of antelope or something like that. Except that as something developed in our own consciousness and our own psyche, this huge divide took place. And the divide was around something that is unique to human beings, which is religion. A lot of animals, by the way, use tools, and Mumford makes that point that tool making is not unique to human beings. There are a lot of animals that use tools and have technology. I mean, beavers, ants, bees. There's lots of examples of that. But symbolic pursuits, what he calls symbolic interests and abstract interests like language and religion, those are unique to human beings. And one of the expressions of the most primitive religious feeling or religious sentiment was this idea that one is supposed to honor the dead. And so the very first evidence that we have of any sort of settlement, these are actually burial mounds to which hunter-gatherers would come back periodically to honor their ancestors who were buried there. And so this is an amazing thing. You think of a city, I don't know, most people would think of some sort of like storage location or defense or some other practical thing. But in fact, it's not any of that. All of that comes later and it's all part of it, but it's not the integral part. The integral part was something completely abstract in a sense and completely non-material. It was this notion that one should honor the ancestors. And this idea is so entrenched in all of the cultures, all the primitive cultures throughout the world. We even we have it in the Bible. The Jews refer to their land as the land of where the graves of our forefathers are. And it's universal. This idea of reverencing. Well, we have cemeteries today, right? In New York City, there's a lot of real estate devoted to cemeteries that could otherwise have, pragmatically you think, well, we could have built some projects here or whatever, but no, they're not going anywhere. They're staying, and I'm glad they are because they have a purpose. They serve a particular purpose. So that was an amazing insight. And when I read that, I thought this guy is a really insightful thinker, because you wouldn't get that from from most books I've read on history or Greece or whatever. None of them really emphasize that point. It's all there in the background, but it's not really emphasized. And so he brings it to the forefront and says, no, the very first foundational thing is not material. It's actually this idea of community that's based on some sort of symbolic ritual. And that's more important to them, or as important to them as all the other things, like getting food and getting protection and so on. I also like to think of Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton, who famously said that we should allow our dead to vote. And that was his sort of apology for conservative thinking, to say that, that's really when we try to preserve customs, what we're doing is we're allowing our ancestors to vote with us on what should happen. And I thought that kind of fits in with what Mumford is saying here. Right. Egyptian pyramids is a great example of this idea taken to an extreme. The pyramids are, in fact, they serve a singular purpose. They are a gigantic burial monument. And that civilization was kind of the epitome of this idea taken to an extreme, perhaps, but still it's there. And pyramids did not serve any other purpose besides that symbolic purpose. And how much energy was expended on facilitating that is amazing. Okay, so there's a lot in the city and history. Mumford talks about this transition from sort of hunter-gatherer lifestyle, a lifestyle that's dominated by hunters and by men, into a lifestyle of settlers, which is dominated by growing things and by women. And I thought that was a great segue into a lot of appreciation for kind of the symbiosis of men and women. Or a lot of times in our culture, we focus on this fighting between the two genders, the two sexes. But really, Mumford emphasizes that very early on, human beings started to converge, the culture started to converge to some sort of symbiotic relationship between the hunter and the keeper of fire and the keeper of domestic animals, and all of these tasks that were associated with early female culture. And in fact, he talks about the very shape that the city and its structures took. It was in a lot of ways resembling what he calls feminine uh, uh, geometry, if you will, for lack of a better word. So you have a lot of containers. You have a lot of these places that contain, just like a woman's womb is a container, right, par excellence of new life. So you have a lot of these, even developing of all of these jars and jugs and all of these ways to keep food and so on. The huts. There's just so much that follows that same principle of containment and creating space for something, right? To store it, to keep it, and so on. So that was another interesting insight that I really enjoyed reading about. So that's The City in History. Really highly recommend this book to trace it all the way. He traces, then he goes further and further into the actual development of these centers, a lot of which are still with us today. And they all trace back to some sort of, it's amazing to trace back cities like Rome, Jerusalem, Mecca, Lourdes, a lot of these cities that grew out of religious beliefs and symbolic ritual, much more so than anything else. And so these cities are still very much in demand, I would say, today. All the other factors, of course, come to play, and cities become channels of communication and hubs of communication and so on. But all of that starts from the very early kind of this ideal of religious and symbolic thinking, if you will, non-material thinking. Finally, switching back to The Myth of the Machine, this is really a seminal work of Mumford's, and he traces modern history and the development of technology and its interplay with human culture in modern history, I would say, starting with the age of exploration and onwards. And it's a sad story in a lot of ways, but also hopeful if we can learn from it. That's the main takeaway, I think, from that book is if we never really come face to face with the issues that we face today, never really understand them head on, never really tackle them, but always just push them to the side, then we'll keep repeating the same mistakes, and they'll become more and more horrendous. The crimes that were committed in the last couple of centuries have outshone pretty much everything else that came before that. And the reason is because our power is increasing exponentially, but our control of that power and our ability to contain it and to understand it and to understand our own humanity and our own needs is not following the same pattern. It's not exponentially increasing. In fact, you can argue that as we're dominated by things that we understand less and less, our ability to control that genie is decreasing. And so Mumford talks about this idea of the frontier and how, when people came to, I mean, it's great to talk about, we're all in the New World in the United States, right, in Canada. People came over the ocean with the idea that they can somehow rid themselves of the ills of the old world and form a new society here. Well, you can't really form a new society unless you understand what got you into the predicament in the first place. So it was a good idea, but they never understood what it was that they were running away from. And they never, the way Mumford puts it very eloquently, he says, the wilderness that Western man had failed to explore was the dark continent of his own soul. So there's a frontier inside of us that we need to understand before we go out and start going west or east or up into the cosmos, trying to colonize everything in sight. Because all we're doing is we're just spreading ourselves thin. We're not really solving anything. And in fact, what happened was the opposite. In Europe, nations were somewhat limited by this balance of power, and you could not commit atrocities without atrocities being committed back on you. Whereas in the New World, the technological superiority of Europeans was so great, there was no balance of power. And when that balance of power was unchecked, great atrocities resulted because they were not bound by any sort of understanding of what it is that actually was beneficial for them long term. I mean, everybody was looking for short-term gains of gold and for land and so on, but really didn't understand that their descendants and would have to pay the price for all these things centuries after them. So yeah, so Mumford raises a lot of these questions head on, talks about certain misunderstandings about human nature, both on the good side, on kind of on the positive and on the negative. Of course, famously, he criticizes perhaps, well, probably not perhaps, he criticizes Rousseau for his kind of short-sighted vision of humanity as, again, being sort of like having this germ of goodness that just needs to be unshackled and let loose, and then everything else would sort of naturally follow. And we probably know today that that's not how it works, and that in fact we need to balance the good and the bad in us. And there are social structures. There are, again, those symbolic ritual structures that are meant to do just that. And so when we throw everything off in this sort of lust for power and lust for more control over nature and ourselves, in fact, what's happening is we're losing control and we're losing our own humanity. I think it's very timely, all of these discussions, as again, we're standing at the essentially at the dawn of this new age with OpenAI, ChatGPT, with genetic engineering. I mean, so many technologies that are just making our heads spin in the last decade or so are completely overwhelming us, and we still haven't really, we're just beginning to understand what it is that's happening to us. And so I think it's understanding Mumford, understanding the perspective that he gives is very vital and timely and essential if we have any hope of, number one, keeping our sanity, but also trying to understand what is actually happening around us, and then orienting ourselves so that we can help to have a clear head, and then help others around us to have a clear head about what is actually happening. It's very dizzying. If I know this, it's hard for me because I'm on Twitter, I'm on social media, I follow a lot of things, and it can be very dizzying with the sort of this constant flow of bits and bytes, but very little actual deep information and insights. And so Mumford provides a lot of that, which what we don't have today with the internet and with this culture of, instead of reading, kind of browsing everything. So I find Mumford a very great antidote to our kind of practices and culture today. So with that, I've been talking for almost 30 minutes. I'll stop, and I want to pause and give you guys a chance to, again, say what perhaps some of the things that I failed to mention, some of the things that you find important and want to bring up, or if you have any questions about anything that was said so far, you can do that. So I'll leave the floor to you. You can either type an exclamation point in the chat, or raise your hand, whichever. It's a small group, so we can do it kind of play by ear. Jeannie, go ahead. You're muted, sorry. Always happens.
I had read Mumford, many years ago, and one of the books that you didn't mention was he wrote a book on utopias, which I thought was really interesting. But what led me this time to Mumford was, looking at McLuhan, and McLuhan is also looking at technology and how it affects, the our human state of mind, and what we're doing. And McLuhan talked a lot about figure ground, and Mumford is actually bringing the ground up. And that was not done that much. It was mainly people just looked at, this is an artifact, kind of like what Phil was saying. But, it's what was behind the ground of that artifact that actually is the important thing. And that is what's making the society really change. So I got really into McLuhan, and hoping to see some kind of predictive thing. But McLuhan was very careful not to predict, and he only wanted to give tools of how we can look at technology as it is now. But he did not give us much guidance as to what was happening. Mumford, on the other hand, I mean, he has both the pessimistic of like, oh my God, look at what we're doing to ourselves, but also the optimistic idea that we can study ourselves and figure out how to make it right. And I mean, he actually does have a kind of utopian view of how if we really studied ourselves, we really study what's going on with technology, the effects and causes, and the things that are happening as a result, some of them that are, the unintended consequences or whatever, the things that are happening that we really didn't plan on, but they end up being sometimes dominant, that, those things need to be really studied and examined. So I wanted, one of the other things that was leading me was this whole idea of the machine as prosthetic. And I've been tracing that idea. Just actually, it was so shocking to me, the idea that technology amputates. And I mean, it's so disturbing to me. I had to see what it was, and it's from Freud, because Freud said man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god.
Aesthetic God, yes. Mhm.
When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he is truly magnificent. And this is kind of like Sullivan, also had this idea of man as being this magnificent thing. And Mumford was a supporter of Sullivan, actually helped him a lot. So, and then it went into, Mumford mentions it, and then McLuhan mentions it, the amputation thing. And then it came up in the design way. And in the design way, it was the lame gods in service of the prosthetic gods. And the whole thing, it was so disturbing to me. That's why I just had to kind of follow the, procession of this idea through these different thinkers. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Jeannie, you totally stole my thunder. I was going to mention that. No, that's okay. That's great. I'm glad we're actually thinking along the same lines. This is perfect. I was going to quote that prosthetic god. In fact, it's in my notes. As I was writing this, I thought, okay, this would be a great segue into Freud, because we just did another meetup on civilization and its discontents, where you're quoting from. And Freud says exactly the same thing, or he points out the same thing, where he says that, technology doesn't really solve man's greatest needs, deepest needs. All it does is it kind of makes us more effective in certain material pursuits, but it doesn't solve the underlying fundamental needs of the human psyche. And he's not sure, the book is quite pessimistic too. He's not sure it can ever be solved because of our own makeup. Our own makeup actually prevents us from being fully satisfied, because of kind of the way we're built, right? We always want more. It's kind of built into our nature. We can never just sit back and just enjoy life. Otherwise, we'd still be sitting back in our caves. So we always have this notion of improvement, but at the same time, it kind of creates this endless cycle of dissatisfaction. which is again a good and a bad thing. But thank you, Jeannie. That was great. Anyone else?
Well,
Want to
so
go ahead?
so Bill and Jeannie, I may be a little bit of an outlier here with regard to Mumford, but I'm not sure, given some of the things that I've taken from what he wrote. Um, I think there are some questions here regarding, if push came to shove, what really is the foundation of these orientations? What's the foundation of the house? I get there's a big house here with a lot of rooms, in his writings and things he saw and how he contributed. But I'm more fascinated actually with the foundation for that thinking. And so, for example, this is from one of the reviews of some of his writings. In his book, The Condition of Man, published in 1944, interestingly enough, 1944, I mean, that's a pretty consequential year in the history of
Yeah,
humankind.
yes.
Mumford characterized his orientation towards the study of humanity as, quote, organic humanism. The term's an important one because it sets limits on human possibilities, limits that are aligned with the nature of the human body. Mumford never forgot the importance of air quality, of food availability, of the quality of water, or the comfort of spaces, because all these elements had to be respected if human beings were, I mean, this is to thrive. I would say to survive. Um, that technology and progress could never become a runaway train as long as organic humanism was there to act as a brake. And I think that that's kind of a hint towards some of the I actually think one of Mumford's most important books was uh, this was it Faith for Living? Is that the title of it? Where I think he really goes more into, yeah, Faith for Living, where he really provides more of what's underneath these things, these critiques that he's giving of society and quote on, seeming progress. He sort of gets underneath it and says, and in a way, I think it's a critique uh, uh, of McLuhan, that the the relationship to the growth of technology without consideration of morality, um, which may well be connected to humanity being able to successfully move forward together, even in consideration of not just the ancestors, which is fine, but really more seventh generation future. Um, I mean, great, celebrate the ancestors, good. But I mean, wait a minute, what about the seventh generation forward? And I find that, in the overall balance of things, actually more compelling. And um, that there's an orientation here in Mumford that I think is very important, and I think in some ways underconsidered. Um, and it would come out if we had a conversation if we'd ask him, okay, I get it. This is your opinion on this, and here's your opinion on that, and here's your opinion on this person's thinking, and here's your person on that technology or whatever. Okay, why? and I don't want to lose that in this conversation, because I think you kind of get lost in the house and don't really see the foundation, which
Mhm.
in some ways I think is actually more intriguing, and
So in your mind,
missing.
Jeff, what is the foundation that from
Well,
everything else springs?
um, I, you know, um, the 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 articulation of his kind of personal philosophy and maybe religion is remarkably untheological. You know, it's remarkably, because he says, well, there's a role for religion and, all that. It's all good and well. But when pressed, to write about it in Faith for Living, his own book about this subject, it's about, he writes about common values. Really, he's writing about morality. He's writing about the underlying ability to survive and thrive for the entire human race. For example, the figure in ground. Okay, well, fine. So there's one figure and there's the ground. Well, wait a minute. What about the atmosphere? Wait a minute, what about other figures? And the figure ground metaphor, I think, is really lacking. There needs to be at least one more figure there for this to even, survive, in my mind, being adequate. And there needs to be some consideration that the figure lives in an atmosphere, however you consider that to be, whether it's culture or certainly, the ability to actually physically live. And I think Mumford would have appreciated those additions to the figure ground metaphor as being significant, and would have found just the figure in ground as wholly inadequate as a as the basis for in other words, I think he would have cared less. I'm not sure. So this is who knows? This is an entire speculation. Given his orientation to technology, I think he would have cared less about being thought of as a quote unquote original thinker, which is really just a way of moving forward. Original, so what? So whether, and you really think that you're original, well, good luck with that. You really think you got that out of thin air and it's just unique to you. Good luck with that. There's a lot that happened pre-verbally to you before you were 1 year old, and so his consideration would have been, I think his closer to the chief among his, guiding factors in his orientation would have been a morality about the future of the world, and that was an important guiding principle, and it was not about one person and their ground. He's trying to integrate a lot of things here, and in that kind of poly orientation, I think that that he got some things that others missed. But I could be completely wrong about this, because I'm a dilettante when it comes to him. But just things that I've been impressed with that I happen to see of his writings.
No, these are all really good observations, Jeff. I appreciate you.
Well, they might be wrong, Phil. They might be me imposing my own values onto him. And which is quite possible. But
we're doing this the Socratic, back and forth, Socratic dialectic, right? So it's fine to be wrong. Well, as long as we're ascending higher and higher from our wrong thinking. So let's go in circles, and I'm totally fine doing that. As long as we're spirally ascending upwards, but eventually. Anyway, but that's a great question. And now that you've raised that, I do want to maybe think out loud a little bit about that. What is foundational in Mumford's thinking? Where is he getting kind of his ideas from? And I tend to go back to the first thing that somebody writes or says when I'm exploring these types of questions, because I feel like you get your most deep insights as a young person or as a person in your prime, and then everything else is just expounding that. And so to me, the foundational work is Technics and Civilization. And the chord that Mumford really struck with me there was this realization that the most important advancement or progress that human beings made was not about spears or knives or axes or whatever. It was plowing and forming our own souls, our own consciousness. I mean, think about this. As a child, try to go back to the very first moment that you were actually conscious. I mean, most of us don't remember that. But think of what it means when you, for the first time, you realize that you are alive and you are something separate from the rest of the world. I mean, it's kind of Freudian and a lot. What's the other guy's name? I always forget, the famous psychologist that followed Freud.
Carl Jung.
Young, but particularly developmental psychologist.
Piaget.
Yes, thank you, Piaget. Thank you very much. Terrible with names. Piaget, yes, of course. So think of what it means for a child to start grasping that he is who he is, or she is who she is, and this idea of the world around you. And now, what was it like for the very first human beings to actually wake up, if you will, right? Wake up from the slumber and become self-conscious. I mean, all of a sudden you realize there's a night and a day, and night is scary and day is less scary, but then the whole world is kind of scary, and there are people around you that might hurt you, and there are things around you that you cannot control. I mean, all of that had to be absolutely dizzying, and I mean, how do you make order out of that chaos? And so the emergence of religions, the emergence of these symbolic things that we developed as ways of dealing with that, and how long it took. I mean, it probably took millennia or dozens of millennia to develop some sort of coherent picture of the world around us into something that we could use to cope with, dealing with what it means to be alive. And so all of that in my, I mean, Mumford brings all this up to say, in relative importance, this completely annihilates all these other completely petty things when you think about bows and arrows and all this other stuff. I mean, that's nothing. Beavers do that. Beavers can build a dam, and it's pretty complicated, but that's nothing compared to what it means to formulate a worldview, to formulate language, to formulate concepts, to orient your consciousness in a way that you're able to function. And so that, to me, was such an amazing insight, and everything flows from that. So if you take that as a foundation, then the next thing is, okay, well, now we're kind of getting an idea of what it means to actually be human, right? Because we were animals, but now we're taking this animal and we're trying to domesticate it in some way. We're domesticating ourselves. We're not just domesticating cows. We're domesticating our own psyche from this insanely violent, insanely chaotic being into something that is a creative being, a being that can create literature and music and art and society and so on. And so all of that, now, where does technology come in? Well, technology can either help us on this quest or it can hurt us. And so to me, everything that Mumford writes has to be seen through that lens of either symbiotic relationship with technology, which is quite precarious to begin with, because as Jeannie mentioned, it's always a prosthesis, right? It's always some sort of extension that's somewhat artificial, no matter what it is. I mean, from the very first time we picked up a stick and it became an extension of our hands got weaker, right? Because now we have a stick that can do the same amount of work with less muscular effort. And everything else is the same exact principle, right? We have excavators. We don't have to be strong enough to, because we can just jump into an excavator and do the same amount of work, or 100 times the amount of work that can be done manually. So all of that in some way takes something away from us. And it's not just our muscles. A lot of it has to do with memory. A lot of it has to do with engagement, our social engagement. So think of, he brings up this idea of medieval guilds and the social network that underpinned that. Compare that to a factory floor. There is no social network. I mean, you're an atom. You come in, you work at will, you get fired. And I mean, I'm thinking, I guess, like 1900s, right? So actually the time that Mumford was maybe what, 10 years old, 12 years old. So he saw all of that firsthand. I mean, when were those famous fires in New York that incinerated people in the, what was that building? The wool building or
The shirtwaist.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
he was growing up in that very period, watching all of this happen, and the dehumanizing effect that all of that had. So I'm sure it was very real to him, all this stuff, watching all of this, watching kids work and parents work, and how they were all huddled into these factories. And I mean, I worked at a factory in my 20s. I was a furniture making plant, and it was awful. I mean, it's awful. The noise, speaking of air quality, you had to wear a mask, but still your face and nose and everything. And I'm glad I did, because it gave me a real good insight into what, how other people live, and how, what happens when the air quality is not that great and everything else. And so I'm sure Mumford experienced all of that to a much greater degree. It was terrible towards the turn of the century there, as far as working conditions, and technology was kind of unbridled, right? There was no balance. It was just going, and the fear that I think he had, and I think we all should have, is this technology has a sort of a life of its own, and a vector of its own, and we need to start bending that vector in the direction that we want it to go, and not just go along for a ride. So I think these are the kind of the foundational questions. That's my take on it. Anyone else? The ladies, do you have any additional words of wisdom for us? Jeannie, go ahead. Sorry, you get your hand.
So, one of the things, I mean, Marshall McLuhan also was not like absolutely pro technology, even though, as you know, he's sort of put in that light as being a leader of technology, but he actually was trying to put the brakes on. And the reason he was trying to put the brakes on was because of the moral issues of it. And the way Mumford sees it, I think, is that the cultural changes didn't keep up with the technological changes. And this has become even more so going into the electronic age, where the technologies, I mean, one of the things he mentions in the Technics and Civilization is the precursors of what happened. And I mean, it's sort of a funny thing. Many of the technologies were preceded by toys so they didn't even have a use. They were thinking, and they thought of God as a machine. So there were many things that preceded the way we developed the machine to prepare us for handling it. Even though Mumford seems to think that we handled technology very well until it got to the modern age, where he thought it became totally out of control. But in the time now, we don't even have a chance to think about the things they're all of a sudden thrust upon us, and we're really not ready for them in a moral sense. And I think that's, with both of the two writers I've been looking at, Mumford and McLuhan, they both are saying the moral issue is a big problem of rushing ahead with the technologies, because we just don't even know what we're doing.
So can I offer some words of hope? I feel like a lot of these meetups, they're all like doom and gloom. So I want to diverge slightly from that and offer maybe a hopeful take on what's happening today. So one of the things that is encouraging, and the trend that I see personally today with regards to all of this, is the fact that technology is at a point where it's actually becoming possible for individuals to have extremely powerful means of production at their very disposal. I mean, this is kind of like Marx, with means of production, but it is true. There's actually a course, or is it like almost yeah, it's a course at MIT called I think it's jokingly called Center for Bits and Atoms. And basically what they discuss is, how do you make machines that can make almost anything? And it's if you go to cba.mit.edu, you will get a bunch of links from there, and you can explore around and see what I'm talking about. But the main import of all of that is to say that we're almost at a point where we have such powerful technology at our disposal that we could potentially revert back to this medieval guild model, or a model where most people can start doing things for themselves, as opposed to being dependent and becoming cogs in a wheel of kind of the overarching system that we're kind of trapped in. And so there is a possibility of both an exit, which is not ideal, but another possibility is coexistence as more independent and more of free-thinking members of society. And this was the ideal that oh, thank you, Kay. This was the ideal of some of the early antebellum American writers, and Mumford mentions several of them, obviously Thoreau, Emerson, Melville, all of these guys. And I want to add Jack London to this series. He didn't have Jack London because Jack London was somewhat a contemporary to, well, not quite, but I guess he predated him a little bit. But Jack London is definitely in that same vein in terms of kind of independence and going back to the land and going back to nature as kind of this healing path of renewal, and as opposed to becoming, being trapped in a city and being trapped in again, this sort of factory mindless work that turns people into animals, right? That's really what we're seeing, or we could be seeing. And so I'm hopeful, because I feel like now we're almost at a point where, given current technological advances, we could see people being able to build a home for themselves. Instead of buying a home, you can build your own home. You could potentially, with advances in technology, you could grow your own food in that home. And so that it's fresh and healthy and so on. And so basically, as soon as you have those means of production and self-sufficiency in terms of providing for yourself, well, now it's a different, it's going to change society, right? The regress from farmers being the dominant section in society to workers being the dominant section was actually not great. I mean, Marx was wrong about, I feel like, and again, in my opinion, was wrong about it, because farmers are very independent and very idiosyncratic, perhaps sometimes ignorant, but they do have this sort of, it's hard to trick a farmer because you can't BS them for very long. They're very pragmatic, and they know which end is up. So I feel like you can endlessly trick a person from academia, but you cannot trick a farmer as easily. Now, if you take a person from academia and you teach him how to farm, that's it. Now you have the ideal philosopher king at your disposal. And so perhaps we might be moving in that direction, I'm hoping, which might be helpful in terms of diluting some of the balance of power, which is, again, another huge emphasis that Mumford has, right? It's all about power. Technology shifts the natural balance of power towards centralization, right? I mean, it's an obvious observation, but it's an observation we should never forget. In medieval times, which Mumford kind of looks at in somewhat idealistic fashion, there was a certain balance of power because there wasn't enough power there wasn't technology for any one person to sort of mow everybody over. With the introduction of gunpowder, the castles, which essentially served to dilute and decentralize power in kingdoms, that all vanished, and castles became kind of a historical dead end, right? In terms of military strategy or defense, they no longer defended you. And so power was centralized, and you have this, the Louis XIVs and then so on. And now power is even more centralized with the rise of the bureaucratic class, which is less personal than a king. A king, at least, is a person. that could be deposed or dealt with. But a bureaucratic class that we have today, that's a little trickier to point a finger at, right? And we have seen a rise of governments, bureaucracies, the state apparatus, all of which in Mumford's way of thinking is serving to dehumanize us further, because we're removing the natural human relationships and we're turning it all into statistics and becoming sort of this governed by statistical tables, which is exactly what's happening today, right? If you follow the economists, they're looking at all these unemployment numbers and this and that. I mean, it's not about like, oh, I lost my job. Can my guild, can my friends that I know help me? Can they help me gain a new skill? Can they support me? I mean, this network is gone completely. So we need new social structures to take place of that, and hopefully provide some sort of safety net and social safety net, I guess is the way to describe it. Go ahead, Jeff.
Jeannie, you have your hand up as well. Okay, I'm sorry I had to step away there. Our youngest daughter was leaving New York to go to Sweden, and I had to give her a hug goodbye. So first of all, the latter part of what I heard you say, Phil, I'm really quite taken with that. I'm really the depersonalization of within a country and an economic system, and where for example, the economists are famous for seeing the changes that need to happen without actually considering the significance of the human suffering that will occur in the transition, and actually not even really caring that much about it. That's not their focus. And trying to get the attention of the society to pay attention to the costs of the transition is a very, very challenging thing. And there are such huge winners and losers in those transitions. Truly massive life and death implications. And that's an interesting consideration with regard to the size of the whatever's considered to be a collective entity, whether it's a family or a neighborhood or a city or whatever it is, the place where you feel some sort of actual relatedness and some actual, based on some level of personal connection, that we are somehow in this together, and that we're going to look out for each other, and we're going to win together, and we're going to move forward together, and we're going to solve problems together. We're not going to solve problems that are going to generate massive winners and losers, and that question of what I think you're doing there, Phil, is you're questioning the underlying orientation for the political and economic systems of a group, whatever group that is, whether it's your neighborhood or your country. You're questioning the underlying orientations and asking this question that I was attributing to Mumford. Well, what are your morals here? Why is it important to pay attention to these things and not those? Are we actually all in this together, or is it just dog eat dog? What actually what is this really? And are our tribes going to go to war with each other simply because they're our tribes? Do we have to let go of this stupid tribal orientation so we can stop? Can you have tribes and nuclear weapons? I mean, wait a minute, and some of the tribes have nuclear weapons, and wait a minute.
It's complicated. It's complicated, yes.
It's complicated, but it begs. I mean, personally, I'm more fascinated with the foundations, because I think that what you were raising there are foundational questions with implications for everything from philosophy and religion to politics and economies, and even to education and orientation of the children, and even the criteria for various decisions in terms of the advancement of humanity. I really think that the foundations and and the larger vision and values need to be the criteria for making decisions about all this stuff in the middle.
Mhm.
And what happens is we get sort of enamored with all the stuff in the middle without saying, all right, what are we basing all this on? And what
Right.
is it that we're actually trying to co-create? And if we could let those be more powerful guides, more powerful criteria, much more heavily weighted criteria for the decisions we're making on a day-to-day basis about all the stuff in the middle, maybe we could make things a little better.
And then
That's
better
my
is
personal
also
that's my
better
personal
is,
orientation.
yeah, better is also a value judgment that goes back to your orientation and
It
morality.
is, which I think is better is a moral question.
Yeah. No, that's
It-
absolutely right. I mean, I was reading something a while back about, we have two major political parties in the United States. Ultimately, if you forget the politics, it boils down to a view of human nature. Underneath it all, underneath all this nonsense, it's a difference in the fundamental difference in understanding what is human nature? What is it like? You have the progressivists and you have the liberals thinking this, and you have the conservatives who are thinking something else. And everything else in terms of policy, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of domestic policy, like you said, education, it all kind of grows from there. In terms of Mumford, I would say kind of the same thing, right? He makes certain assumptions about what does it mean to be human? And he is interested, if I understand him correctly, in preserving that nucleus of what it means to be human, right? Now that assumption, I agree, should be made completely explicit so that we can judge it on its merits and say, okay, fine, I agree with that assumption or I don't agree with that assumption.
right.
There's a whole movement of transhumanism that says, you know what, it doesn't matter what we started out as. Let's transcend all of this, leave it all behind. Doesn't matter. If we just
Mm,
take, if we transcribe our neurons into some sort of database and give us some sort of metal frame, we're going to be much more durable. We're going to live forever. Who cares if it's not a human experience? Well, it's going to be a transhuman experience, right? So, and that's an argument, right? That's an argument too. Um, Fundamental questions of value. What do you value more? Do you value the flesh and bone and all of this stuff to the point where you're going to stick with kind of the church pews and the hymns? Or do you value kind of this endless progress, which is going to lead us somewhere? We don't know where it's going to lead us eventually, maybe back to atoms floating in the universe, right? The perfect entropy state or something like that. So yeah, deep questions. And I agree with you, Jeff, that it's fundamental to make sure to make them explicit at the very least. Yeah, this is a great discussion. I was curious which term we're going to take, but this is great. Jeannie, go ahead.
Well, one of the problems is, we would like to make these things explicit, and it seems so obvious. I mean, for one, we're animals and we need to have our animals' needs met. I mean, that should be just a given right there, and then there's the social and all that stuff. That should be a given too. But when you even get even a step beyond that, it begins to conflict with our economic goals. And our economic goals are just way out of control, so that we're not thinking of these basic things. And that's part of the problem. And I think Mumford identifies that as, well, there were a number of things. Let me see. I'll just read these off. Purposeless materialism, superfluous power, well, cooperation instead of slavery, the direct attack, or we have our romantic and our utilitarian. We have a cult of the past, which is dragging us backwards. In many cases, it doesn't need to. And then we have the return to nature, which Phil mentioned, as a kind of, we're trying to escape back, but, is that going to work? Is there enough nature to go around? I wonder, with, what is it, 7 billion now? And then he talks about mass sport, as we use mass sport to kind of divert our attention. It's amazing how important, the Phillies are. Why? I'm not sure. And then our cult of death, which of course is war.
Jeannie, my wife refers to the sports as the people who are wearing that color shirt compared to the people who are wearing this color shirt. And every once in a while, they trade somebody else over there who decides to wear the color shirt of that team. And then this team trades, but you still root only for the people who are wearing the right color shirt. And
yeah, they're not even regional anymore. I mean, your players are from all over. And then we have these minor shock absorbers. One is the private world, which we develop a private world where we're safe. And then we can ignore the rest of the world and say, well, and I think, unfortunately, this ideal world where we become the makers of our own, house and, grow. I think that's part of that private world. I'm not sure that's going to work. Change for its own sake, so that everything new is the important thing. It's got to be new. And you have something like that where we have these piles of clothing. Did you hear about that? Like 39,000 tons per year are being dumped in this desert in North Chile. I think. And, and they're set there because there's no rain. So they're just sitting there, and they're, so they don't decompose. They could be a repository, but they've decided that these piles are too big. They can be seen from space. So they started burning them, and now they're burning them, and all that. It's all toxic stuff because so much polyester in the clothing. Why? It's totally out of control. And then a fantasy, and that you see with the young people in the games, they're like just totally, they live in a different world. They're living in a game. They don't even know what's going on in the rest of the world. And then continuous stimulation. And you can see that in our culture. We, always we have to do this, and then you finish with that, you have to do this. I'm actually into delayed gratification because it slows down that constant stimulation. Because you want this, and then you get it, then you have to get that. And it's just unstoppable. So we have these sort of runaway trains, in our life that are probably going to hurt us, and probably going to hurt the 7th generation too.
Yeah, but Ginny, as I was listening to you about sports and games and so on, all of this stuff, it's exactly what he's talking about, symbolic activity, right? It doesn't really mean anything, but it's there because we need it. We need something. We can't just survive on 3 meals a day, right? We need something that occupies our minds, our imagination. And games, I mean, Mumford mentions Huizinga, I believe, who wrote Homo Ludens, playing man, right? That's part of our culture, is about imagination to a large degree, and vision, right? Those two are together. And so
you're right, Phil.
yeah. And so if you lose imagination, and games and fantasy and sports even probably is to some degree about giving our brains a space, a much needed space where we can just watch, maybe kind of zone out, root for the team, and maybe associate something happy about one player. I don't know. Like I'm not a big sports fan, so I mean, I can kind of picture it. I used to watch sports when I was like little, but I don't now anymore. And I've kind of forgotten the excitement already of like, rooting for your own team. I mean, it's fun. It's entertaining. I'm not sure how much additional like imaginative values are there, but it's definitely a social activity. And that's a huge part of, ancient rituals. Theater in Greece was all about, it wasn't just entertainment, it was getting together, right? You're celebrating Dionysus, you're celebrating something, and it's a social thing. And sports is definitely hugely social, even with it being remote and people watching it on cable or whatever. You talk about it in the office, right? You go back to the office and the next day, everybody's like, "Oh, did you watch that game? Did you see him score? Did you do da, da, da?" So it creates the social cohesion where it used to be maybe about church. People would, well, did you listen to the pastor? Did you, remember the sermon? Oh, he messed up there. Now they're talking about something else, right? So it's all part of the human nature, and to the degree that I would say probably sports is compensating for the loss of other creative pursuits and activities. We still need some outlet. We haven't been completely turned into machines yet. And so sports becomes this other avenue for human expression of our creativity, expression of our emotions. Our emotions are atrophying, right? Because people can't even express what they're thinking or feeling. They have to send a little emoji, right? Or worse yet, emojis actually is good. And I find that sometimes I do this myself, so I'm kind of preaching to myself now. I'll find, how people find a picture of a famous actor laughing or doing something, expressing a particular emotion, and you put that on your phone, you send that. So in other words, you can't even express whatever, you just slap somebody else's emotion on top of yours. And that's in other words, you're vicariously feeling through them. Like you're expressing disgust or whatever. Yes, Jeff, exactly that. Yes.
Well, Phil, one of the things I wanted to return to before I had to step away for a moment there, um, I've always found it um, intriguing to do exactly what you were doing there, sort of imagine into, the progressive awareness, consciousness, not only as it might have developed, in human beings, but also how it develops, in as much as we can see of it that might be similar, um, in, from a baby to a person. And so you're going down that road, of sort of awareness, you know, and there's some things I would add to what you were saying there, and I actually jotted them down because I wanted to come back to them. So, I think there is that, in that awareness that somehow at some point, dawns upon a human being. Let's imagine, around the age, let's say, of a year to a year and a half to two, to three even, and whatever the equivalent might be there, in the dawn of human consciousness, you know, that that there are things you want to have that you can't necessarily have. Think about our joke with our children was, what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine. It just sort of like, well, there it is. It must belong to me. It's mine. And but you think about that seems so in a way, infantile.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? That's actually a significant part of the ongoing human condition between adults, and even between countries, I mean, that other and another is so, the first consciousness is maybe what the individual is thinking. However, I'm making sense of whatever I'm seeing around me and somehow learning from it. I don't even know if it's chosen or not. It might be chosen, but I mean, somehow I'm sponging up some stuff, you know, and then to encounter the first several times and then for a while that some of the things that I strongly thought are actually wrong. Like, how do you come to grips with that? You know, all I really know is my own perception and my own thinking and my own view, you know, what I believe I can see and what I'm saying is therefore true and, you know, blah, 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 on from that to ultimately somewhere at some point, you know, maybe around a year and a half or 2 or 3, somehow having to say, wow, you know, I thought that was correct. And it, at the very least, is not entirely correct and might even be entirely incorrect, you know. That realization among human beings, I think, is it takes such a deep level of consciousness to be actually to get over the defense, the internal defense, as well as the defense between me and others, that I'm right. It's what I think. It's my opinion. It's my conclusion. It's based in reality. It's based in my experience. It's based whatever. Make it up, whatever you want, you know, make up your religion to explain it, whatever you want, you know, I'm right.
Mm.
And I'm going to gather with other people who together think that have the same opinion so we can tell each other how right we are. And we're
Yes.
going to be right. And then we're all really right. And to convince a group of us that, you know, we might not be
Reminds me
right.
of Jonathan Swift, you know, the which end of the egg should be broken, you know, the
Yeah. So this idea that, you know, the individual perception, the collection of individual perceptions and collection of individual, you know, experiences from the vantage point of one person and the individually chosen set of lessons learned and conclusions drawn from those perspectives and experiences, I actually find it more intriguing to ask, and I started asking this at the start of very intensive leadership programs with the executive directors of many of the best nonprofits throughout the entire United States, training them in groups of 50 to 100 at a time. After we'd given each of their organizations unrestricted $200,000 grants and said, you guys are really great, you're doing wonderful things. Now let's come together with, you know, 50 to 100 others. And here's your first question before we start on 4 separate weeks of intensive leadership development. What's something that you, at some earlier point in your life, whenever it was, were pretty sure you were right about that thing, and you subsequently changed your mind?
Where do I
What's
begin?
one thing?
That's right.
Because if you can't tell me one thing in your entire lifetime that was important to you,
Mhm.
about which you had a conclusion based upon experience and whatever, you know, your education or stuff you made up or your religion or your politics or I don't care, you know, whatever it was, your parents told you, it doesn't matter to me. Something that was important to you that you thought you knew what it was and what was important about it. And you subsequently came to by whatever process, you know, um, you changed your mind. Because if you have never changed your mind about anything, there's no reason for you to be in this leadership program.
Of course, of course.
Seriously.
No, sir.
And I invited people to leave. I said, because that means you can't learn.
Of course.
And if you can't learn, then you're going to spend these 4 weeks trying to convince us that you're right. And that's not only boring, but it's just destructive. So
Yeah.
really, you know, you can keep the money, but get out of the leadership program because we don't need you here. If you can't answer that question, and when we get to the end of these 4 weeks that we spent together with some of the most, you know, original thinkers about leadership on the planet, having spent time with us and entertaining all kinds of questions and situations and cases and experiences, if you can't come up with one thing that these 4 weeks together actually shifted your orientation on, well, then it was pretty useless.
Sure.
And so we don't want to get there. So let's start from the beginning, asking a very simple question.
That's great.
And I think that's part of the development of a human being. And even coming to grips with, there are other people who are going to think about things differently from you. They might be wrong, they might be right, but just being able to acknowledge and appreciate that other people might have a different opinion, especially about something that neither one of you can prove is actually right. I have an opinion about where I was before I came to Earth as a being, and I have an opinion about where I'm going after I leave Earth as a being. And I can't prove it either way. And you have an opinion about that, and you may feel strongly about it, but I don't think you can prove it either way either. So, could we just relax a little bit about that and maybe cut each other a little bit of slack, since we're talking about stuff that neither one of us can actually prove?
From your mouth to God's ear, Jeff. I mean, we're
At the
really,
very least, let's not
in
fight wars
society
about it, for
today,
goodness sake.
yeah, high degree of sort of almost at a boiling point. Any discussion turns into some sort of feudal battle. Yeah, no, I'm totally with you there. And by the way, this test that you devised, I think it's very ingenious, and in fact, supported by very good document that, in Mumford's sort of vein, I would recommend people read and spend some time with, which is the Proverbs. One of the first things, if you ever read Proverbs, they have this beautiful description of 3 types of people: the naive, the smart, and the foolish. And the beautiful thing is everybody starts out in the same spot, naive. We all start out there, we don't know anything. But then there's a choice. The fool and the smart. Now, the smart people, the only difference is it's not because he's smart, meaning like he knows anything. He's teachable. That's the point. The smart person is the
Right.
teachable.
Right.
That's a teachable
Right.
spirit. Learns from mistakes.
Yeah. The more I learn, the more I realize I don't know.
Yeah, that's beautiful. We've had quite a few. Ava, I guess, dropped off. I wanted to ask her about. She put a couple of things there about education, and I was hoping she could elaborate a little bit. She was talking about the role of education in Mumford's kind of worldview, but she kind of left it at that. I don't really have a lot to say there. I don't know if any of you know much about Mumford's ideas on education. I haven't really encountered it explicitly, so I don't have much there. Mike, do you have any words of wisdom for us on Lewis Mumford? I don't know if Mike is there. Probably he is, but he's muted. And Katie, I know you're just joining us. We're pretty much actually ready to wrap it up tonight. But I was curious if you had any comments on Mumford, if you've read any of his books or just curious about his ideas. Feel free to chime in. We're just kind of wrapping up here.
I finally found the unmute key. I can say something.
Okay.
Jeff's comment about, have you ever really changed your mind about anything that you really believed, resonated with me. And I think resonated with Mumford. And I'm thinking that it's an evolutionary process that's continually happening rather than a one-time thing where it revolutionarily changes. And so the revolutions tend to really need to be undone because you usually get it wrong on the revolutions. So I also that's one point. The other point is, should you focus? Where should your focus be? And on whether it should be on the good of on the good of everybody, or on a specific thing, or the vassals, or labor, or the military. And what I come to in that situation, the word orthogonality comes in mind. Whatever you focus on, you don't end up with 30 things that are mutually perpendicular to each other. They're all correlated. And so whatever your focus is, as long as you're moving toward excellence, you end up advancing civilization in a pretty good way. And even though it may not always appear as a good way immediately, and it's more or less a concept of a rising tide lifts all boats type thing. And so I'm not, if you're going to pick, if you're going to do a least squares optimization or a maximum likelihood optimization, you may end up creating a singularity that you don't want. So picking the optimization criteria correctly is important, and I think part of our problem is we're not picking it right, and we're creating local optimization situations right now that are not right. And so we look at, are we better off talking about wokeness, or we're better talking about affirmative action, or we're better off talking about what is our optimization criteria, and how we adjust it to favor everybody, or to favor one body, is dangerous. And that's where we're going right now in many of the things we're doing. And I don't know how to. Maybe, well, I do know how to fix it, but I don't. I'm not presumptuous
Mike, you're
enough.
starting to sound like that guy in Dostoevsky's Demons, who had a plan for making the world perfect, and it had like 47 points, and towards the end, it was a disaster. He starts from perfect freedom and ends up in perfect enslavement or something like that.
I know you're into Dostoevsky, and you've introduced me to a lot of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky too. Well, yeah. Which play was this guy who tried to optimize that way, and how he screwed up?
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, Demons. This is where it all happens. Jeannie, go ahead.
Well, one of the things I have to confess that attracted me to both McLuhan and Mumford are their critiques on cars. And although almost everything that I thought when I was 20 is, I think, almost the exact opposite at this point. I have latched onto bicycles and kept with that my entire life, and I still believe in bicycles. Now, neither of these two great thinkers even, I think, mentioned the bicycle, but the problem is we've got a system, we're spending tons and tons of money to keep that system going, and it's not sustainable. And, people are thinking of like a solution of, self-driving cars, as a solution. There's you know, at a certain point, even though you might be wrong in this world, you have to kind of take a step. And, you know, I don't know how to put it any other way, because we're all blind to what is going to happen in the future, and especially all the side effects of the things that will happen. But I just see the car problem as so much of a big problem, and we're investing more and more in it. I mean, if it were just a problem and we could somehow walk away from it, but we're not. We're putting more and more and more money into it, and more faith into it. Like, you know, people have stopped thinking that they could live without a car. And I think that at a certain point you have to make a stand or do something. You know, you can't just say, well, I could be wrong and I'm going to change my mind later or something. You know, it's a cop out. You've got one life, and you need to kind of choose something that you're going to make a stand on. And so for me, I did do that, and I've gotten a lot of backlash, but I love the support of these two thinkers. So, and there's not too many of them out there. So I'll just mention that.
Cheers to
Well,
that.
Jeannie, I'm a big fan of bicycles, but not on the sidewalk doing 20 miles an hour. And I'm
That's
a big
fine.
fan of bicycles, except for those going the wrong way on one-way streets and going through red lights. I'm a big fan of bicycles, paying attention to the rules of the road and being willing to live by them, so as to not kill those of us who are walking on the sidewalk, trying to cross the street. And so I'm a big fan of bicycles, but at least in New York, at this moment, I got a lot of problems with bicycles.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah.
There's been a giant technological leap in the last, I would say, year into the e-bikes, and it's changed everything, and nobody knows how to deal with it. If you think of cell phones, when people first got cell phones, they were so annoying because they talked so loud on them. Do you remember that? And everybody was very irritated at everybody else's behavior on cell phones. We take a little time to adjust, but we've just got a brand new technology, and it's being classified with bicycles. It's not really bicycles, but you know, you have to make certain allowances when we're making a giant leap like that.
Before we get too far down this rabbit hole, since we're almost at time, I do want to thank you, Jeannie, by the way. Thank you for your contribution to our well-being. I do salute you for your efforts. I do want to just take a few moments to summarize what we've not summarized. Obviously, this is impossible, but just to quickly call out a few books for the latecomers. Mike and Katie, I don't know if you guys have read The City and History. This is a great, I don't know, like, yeah, and Jeannie is going to hold up Technics and Civilization, which is, I recommend that. If you haven't read Mumford, read that Technics and Civilization first, and then read The City and History. And I'm holding it upside down, or not, maybe not. Anyway, these are two books that are really, I would say, epitomize a lot of his ideas, which boil down to, as Jeff pointed out, his view of human nature and then how it interplays with technology and kind of the role of technology in human history, the role of, and what it means to be human. I think a lot of Mumford's work really, again, boils down to his view of what is, like, Mike, what you were saying, what are we optimizing for? Well, in Mumford's terms, I think we're optimizing for what it means to be human. We're trying to maximize our humanity and the good things about it, right? And you know, what differentiates us from other animals? Well, Mumford calls it symbolic pursuits, right? It's not material pursuits, because other animals use tools, other animals you have to eat and so on. But what sets us apart is the symbolic ritual and symbolic understanding of the world, consciousness, you know, all of that is part of that, right? Reflecting the world in us and through us. And technology can either ameliorate that, or it can hinder that and squash it and deform it. And so this interplay of both the machines and the mega machine, right? We didn't talk much about that, but the mega machine, of course, is this abstract concept of technology combined with political power, with media, with other channels of influence, and together it becomes this what he calls Pentagon of power, with, of course, with reference to the Pentagon in the United States. But it really transcends the United States. It's really all of human civilization. We have to deal with these issues, and very timely, I would say, as we talked about transhumanism, as we talked about kind of where some of the current issues that we're having with technological development and how it affects our brains, our social and cognitive and emotional abilities, right? I mean, really, it's everything. And Mumford just creates a very good perspective for us. We don't have to agree with it, by the way. I enjoy another person's perspective, not because I necessarily agree with it, but because it forces me to evaluate things from a different viewpoint. And like Jeff was saying earlier, if we're willing to allow ourselves to look at something from a different vantage point, and then we can possibly adapt and change our viewpoints slightly or radically. Maybe radically in case of Jeannie, going from cars to bicycles, and so on, or becoming self-sufficient farmers with 3D printers in their backyards, and genetically modified vegetables, and so on. So yeah, lots of possibilities here. All right, this has been
I want
fascinating.
to mention too, he wrote about utopias.
Yes.
And why not? I mean, why not design a utopia that we want to live in? We are not, we don't have to be victims of what we've already created. We could actually think of something new, and why not look at the utopias that have been tried, most of them, utter failures, and and see
Just
if
don't
we
go to
could maybe
space
do
with it.
something too.
Yeah, let's just not go to space with it. Let's try it first here. Fix the problems at home, and then export it outside. All right.
Well, if I had to convene a team to envision utopia, this would be a great team.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thanks guys for all of your contributions tonight. It's been a really lovely discussion. Really enjoyed it. Obviously this is getting recorded, so if you came in late, feel free to listen to the whole recording, and this will be published in a couple of days. And I will see everyone. If you're interested, we're going to keep going with various thinkers. Still finalizing with Shrikant what we're doing in the next month's session, but stay tuned. So look forward to engaging with you again. Have a good night.
Thanks, Phil, for hosting this.
Sure. Always a pleasure.
And doing the opening presentation, which is always,
Yes.
thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.